Today we're going to talk about what impacts the amount of nutrients that are actually in the food when you consume it. We can lose or gain nutrients in a number of ways. So today we're going to talk about concepts of nutrient quantity, nutrient loss, and nutrient bioavailability. So let's compare and contrast these concepts, nutrient quantity, loss, and bioavailability. So nutrient quantity refers to how much of the nutrient that plant or animal had at the time of harvest or slaughter. So the health of the plant, what the animal was fed, the type of plant variety, the conditions in which a plant has been raised. All of these things can impact the actual nutrients that the plant has at the time that it is removed, if you will, from its natural life or growing phase. So some of the environmental conditions might be the temperature, the air temperature, the amount of light it gets. So of course, it takes a lot longer for tomatoes to ripen, as the season goes on. Sometimes they never do. It gets too cold. So the nutrient content between a green tomato and a red tomato is going to be very different. The soil itself, is the soil been over-harvested? Has nutrients been replenished? Or is it soil that's been utilized over and over again, and so the nutrient quantity in the soil is low? The pH of the soil can impact it, and then the hydration status of the soil as well. Of course, some plants do better in low water environments and some do better in higher water environments. And lastly, farmers have a tendency to add a lot of things to soil in order to enhance the harvest or the growing, and depending on what they choose to use as fertilizers, pesticides, lime, etc., those can also influence the nutrient quantity in a food. And then the last thing that's going to impact the amount of nutrient the plant has, or the animal for that matter, is going to be, how mature it is at the time of harvest. So again, if you pick a green tomato and even if you leave it on the counter for it to turn red, it's going to be a little bit different than if it turned red while it was still attached to the plant. All right, so let's talk a little bit about nutrient losses. Okay, so when we talk about nutrient losses, we're talking about the amount of nutrients that are lost between the time you've harvested or slaughtered the animal until it reaches your mouth. So anything that happens in that in-between space. So we know that the quantity that is in there has already been determined, the growing conditions, the harvest conditions, etc. So now what we're looking at is what happens to it before it gets to your mouth. So again, time of harvest, is it ripe or not ripe? The amount of will determine how much nutrient quantity is in there, but then how long it takes till it gets to the mouth is going to determine how much nutrient loss there is. Transportation methods, temperature within transportation methods, time in transportation, storage conditions during transportation or after transportation, they stored properly, processing, what have you removed, was there heat involved, light involved, things that might destroy nutrients, and then of course your cooking and your reheating, and any processing you do in the home is going to affect the amount of nutrients that are there. Now let's contrast that with the last concept, which is bioavailability. So bioavailability is saying, okay, so after we take into account nutrient quantity and loss, there's a certain amount of nutrients that are now entering your mouth. Now, what percentage or how much of those nutrients actually end up in your bloodstream? And that is what we refer to as bioavailability. How available is that particular nutrient for your body to absorb and utilize? So now let's break these concepts down and kind of compare and contrast the tendencies of vitamins and minerals in terms of loss, quantity loss, and bioavailability. So vitamins are definitely affected by the factors that influence quantity. So animals' products to some degree are influenced by what they're fed, as well as the amount that they're exercised, particularly in terms of fats and the fat-soluble vitamins. And then plant foods, the plant variety, whether it's genetically modified, what type of conditions that the plant has been hybridized for, those will have different amounts of will determine how much nutrients in there. And all the environmental conditions we talked about can impact the vitamin nutrient quantity of a food item. Then also, vitamins are very susceptible to the nutrient losses. This is from harvest to mouth. So again, all the transportation issues, the amount of processing, um, storage, preparation, duration of cooking, temperature of cooking, whether you're cooking in water, freezing for some nutrients, refrigeration, whether exposed to light, pH of cooking and processing. So there is some variability in terms of which vitamins are sensitive to each of these things, but they can affect the amount of nutrients that actually enters your mouth, the vitamins themselves, how much actually enter your mouth. Now, as far as vitamin bioavailability, things that can impact that are, do you have normally functioning digestive enzymes and other chemicals that are needed to release the nutrient from the food? Does it need to compete for binding sites? And is the intestinal tract healthy enough in order to do the absorption? And then are there any special requirements in terms of transportation across the cell membranes into the blood or the lymphatic system? Some require carrier proteins. Are they available, et cetera? All right, so let's contrast that with mineral content. Now, mineral content, nutrient quantity is going to have an effect here. So how much minerals are in the food product will be affected by growing conditions and location, also the type of plant variety can affect minerals. But what's really interesting about mineral content is how much of an influence the soil content has. So if the soil is rich in a particular nutrient, you're going to get higher quantities of that mineral in that food product. Whether it's a healthy mineral or not, we've seen this with arsenic in rice, where now we have arsenic levels too high in rice because the rice kernel itself takes up too much of the arsenic from the growing environment. Nutrient losses, now minerals are much more stable. So we can remove it, we can process it. It's pretty stable during transportation, temperature, etc. We do get minor losses in cooking, but it's pretty stable in terms of nutrient losses. But where we see the biggest difference in minerals versus vitamins is in bioavailability issues. So bioavailability influences mineral levels in the body significantly. So let's just talk briefly about each one of these. So number one, person's needs. So if you're deficient in a mineral, you're going to absorb more of that mineral. If you're not deficient in the mineral, then the body will downregulate absorption. And that is to protect you, because many of these minerals can be, for lack of a better word, poisonous if they were consumed in really large quantities, or they would have negative or detrimental effects. So your individual requirements will help upregulate or downregulate absorption or bioavailability. Many of our minerals are absorbed based on their ionic charge. So whether they are +2 version of the mineral, +3 version of the mineral, and along with that, acidity, both in the intestines and in the food product, is going to help put that mineral in the proper ionic charge for absorption. The next thing is this competition for binding sites. So we do have nutrients that are using the same binding sites. So if you have too much of one nutrient, it's going to interfere with the absorption of another mineral. So taking high doses of iron, for example, can interfere with the absorption of other minerals. And the last thing is something we call chemical interference. So chemical interference is something within the food product that binds up the minerals and makes them more difficult for the body to get at and get them into the absorbable form. And so for examples of that are polyphenols, oxalates, phytates, and fiber. You're familiar with fiber, but we'll talk a little bit about the other three here in a second. So here's an example of the binding site. So if you consume too much zinc, it shares the binding sites with iron and copper. And so high amounts of zinc could cause an iron or copper deficiency. Zinc interferes with, they share the binding sites with zinc and magnesium, so too much zinc can interfere with magnesium absorption and vice versa. Iron, calcium, and magnesium can also, high doses can interfere with the absorption of manganese. All right, so the last concept here to really talk about is this phytates and oxalates, or what we call binding chemicals. So the phytates themselves are within the food product, and they bind up the minerals so that in the intestines they can't be released from the food product and therefore not absorbed. Nutrients we're talking about with phytates are calcium, magnesium, iron, and zinc. And the places we find phytates are in the outer kind of bran layer of seeds or grains. So we're going to see it in whole grains, we're going to see it in nuts, we're going to see it in seeds. So those kinds of foods are going to be fairly high in phytates. Then we have oxalates. This is a different binding chemical. And oxalates bind with calcium and iron in certain foods, not all foods, but certain foods, and reduce absorption. So where we see oxalates is largely in many of your green leafy vegetables. Now, some of your green leafy vegetables are high in oxalates, some are relatively low. But for example, spinach has quite a bit of calcium in it, but it is not a great source of calcium because of the oxalates. We still get quite a bit of iron from spinach, but the oxalates do interfere significantly with calcium. So that would be an example. All right, so let me just summarize what I've talked about here. The amount of nutrients your body actually receives from your food is clearly highly variable. We might look at a nutrient analysis table and it indicates that you get X number of milligrams and micrograms, but there is going to be variability based on all the things we've talked about. Vitamins are generally more susceptible to nutrient losses, and minerals are more susceptible to bioavailability issues. Both are going to be influenced by nutrient quantity issues.